After 50 years of marriage, she lost everything, until her dog uncovered what her husband hid beneath the floor. The morning after the estate reading, Eleanor Whitaker stood in a half-empty house that no longer felt like hers. 50 years of marriage had ended not just in grief, but in foreclosure. Auction signs pierced the lawn, creditors circled, and the man she trusted most had left behind silence. Then her aging German shepherd began clawing at a patch of basement concrete, like he remembered something she didn't. If you discovered your entire future was hidden beneath your own home, would you dig or walk away? The morning Harold Whitaker died began like every other morning Eleanor could remember. Light filtered gently through the cream-colored curtains in the bedroom, the same curtains she had sewn herself in 1983 when the old ones had faded. The house in Cedar Hollow, Ohio, sat quiet and orderly on its narrow suburban lot, its white siding freshly washed the previous spring, its small front porch swept clean every Sunday evening. For 50 years, Eleanor had risen before Harold. For 50 years, she had started the coffee before he ever opened his eyes. She woke at 6:12 a.m., the way her body always did, even without an alarm. The digital clock glowed soft red in the dim room. Beside her, Harold lay on his back, one arm resting loosely over the blanket. His breathing had always been steady and loud, a soft mechanical rhythm she'd once teased him about when they were young. She listened. The rhythm wasn't there. At first, she assumed she had simply woken before it began. She turned her head toward him, studying the familiar lines of his face, the deep crease between his brows from years of squinting over blueprints, the silver stubble he never shaved until after breakfast. His mouth was slightly open, too still. "Harold," she said softly. No response. She reached across the bed and placed her hand on his shoulder. The fabric of his flannel pajama shirt felt cool beneath her palm, cooler than it should have been. She shook him gently. "Harold." The house remained silent. In the hallway, claws clicked against hardwood. Atlas appeared in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered despite his age, his sable coat streaked lightly with gray around the muzzle. His ears were upright, alert. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply stood there, watching. Eleanor pushed herself upright, and her movements stiff but controlled. She had been married to Harold for 50 years. 50 years of shared mornings. 50 years of knowing the weight of him beside her. And yet, as she leaned closer now, she felt something unfamiliar pressing into her chest. Not grief, not yet, but a hollow kind of disbelief. She touched his cheek. Cold. The sound that left her was not a scream. It was smaller than that. A sharp inhale that caught halfway in her throat. The paramedics arrived within minutes. Neighbors stood in their driveways, hands covering their mouths, whispering in hushed tones that carried faintly through the open front door. Cedar Hollow was the kind of place where everyone knew when the mail came late. A flashing ambulance light might as well have been a public announcement. And Eleanor stood in the kitchen while the men in navy uniforms moved through her house. The smell of coffee, freshly brewed, untouched, lingered in the air. Atlas pressed against her leg, leaning his weight into her as if anchoring her to the tile floor. "Ma'am," one of the paramedics said gently, removing his gloves. "It looks like he passed in his sleep, likely sometime during the night. There's no sign of distress." Passed in his sleep, as if Harold had simply stepped into another room. She nodded, because that was what you did when strangers spoke kindly in your own home. She folded her hands together to keep them from trembling. Outside, the sky was clear and pale blue. The maple tree in their yard rustled softly in the early breeze. It was an ordinary Tuesday. By noon, the house was full of quiet movement, calls placed, on a paperwork signed. A stretcher rolled carefully through the front door. Eleanor did not cry. Not when they wheeled him out. Not when the door closed. Not when the engine of the ambulance faded down Maple Street. Atlas stood at the window long after the vehicle disappeared, ears forward, body rigid. The house felt larger by evening. Eleanor moved from room to room as if checking for something misplaced. The dining table was polished. The living room carpet freshly vacuumed. Harold's reading glasses sat exactly where he had left them on the arm of his recliner. His newspaper from the day before lay folded neatly on the coffee table, crossword half finished. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She walked into the bedroom at sunset and stood in the doorway. The bed was still unmade, one pillow slightly indented, while the quiet inside the room pressed against her ears. Atlas entered behind her, then circled once before settling at the foot of the bed. He did not attempt to jump up as he sometimes did when Harold wasn't looking. He simply lowered himself to the floor and watched her. "You're still here," she whispered to him. His dark eyes did not leave her face. For the first time in 50 years, Eleanor Whitaker felt the faintest tremor of uncertainty beneath her feet. Not about grief, not about loneliness, but about something else. Something she couldn't name. The house had always felt like an extension of her hands. She had painted its walls, chosen its furniture, planted its flower beds. She knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft in winter. But as night fell and shadows deepened in the hallway, the rooms seemed slightly unfamiliar, and as though she were walking through a carefully preserved memory instead of a home. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the far wall. 50 years of marriage. 50 years of shared decisions. 50 years of believing she understood the man who had slept beside her. Atlas lifted his head slowly, ears twitching toward the basement door at the end of the hall. The house was silent, yet something inside it felt unsettled. Eleanor lay down on her side of the bed, staring into the darkness. The space beside her remained untouched, cold and still. For the first time in half a century, she felt alone inside her own walls. And though she could not have explained why, the house already felt less like hers. For the first week after Harold's funeral, the house filled with the low murmur of casseroles and condolences. Neighbors from Maple Street came in careful waves, placing covered dishes on the kitchen counter Eleanor had wiped down that very morning. Paper plates stacked higher than necessary. Coffee reheated and forgotten. The same phrases repeated in soft, sympathetic tones. He went peacefully. 50 years is a blessing. You were such a devoted wife. Eleanor stood beside Atlas as though he were another guest receiving visitors. The German shepherd remained unusually quiet, pressing close to her leg, his steady presence grounding her when conversations drifted into silence. Ryan arrived from Columbus 3 days after the funeral. He was 48 now, tall like Harold, his hair thinning at the temples. Melissa came from Dayton the following morning, her voice brisk and efficient as she began sorting through paperwork almost immediately. "There's a lot to organize," Melissa said gently, though her eyes were already scanning the dining room table where Harold's files had been stacked. "Dad handled most of this, didn't he?" Eleanor nodded. Harold had always handled the investments, the refinancing, the insurance policies. He'd once told her it was simpler that way. "You worry about the house, Chums," he had said decades ago. "I'll worry about the numbers." At the time, she had agreed without question. The estate attorney's office was downtown, housed in a red brick building that had stood there longer than most of Cedar Hollow. The elevator creaked softly as it carried them to the second floor. Eleanor walked between her children, and Atlas waiting in the car with the windows cracked slightly for the cool September air. Inside the conference room, everything smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. A wide table dominated the space, legal folders arranged in careful stacks. The attorney, A gray-haired man named Thomas Reed adjusted his glasses and offered condolences once more before opening the file. Harold Whitaker's name sat typed neatly across the top. The first few minutes passed in routine formalities: distribution of minor personal effects, insurance payout procedures, standard language about probate timelines. Then Mr. Reed cleared his throat. "There are outstanding liabilities connected to Mr. Whitaker's infrastructure investments," he said carefully. Specifically related to municipal bridge contracts he co-financed approximately 8 years ago." Eleanor frowned slightly. "I thought he retired from that." "He did," Mr. Reed replied, "but the investment structure remained active. Unfortunately, several of those projects defaulted." Ryan leaned forward. "How much are we talking about?" Mr. Reed turned a page. "Approximately $460,000 in unresolved obligations." The number seemed to float above the table before settling heavily into the room. "That's not possible," Melissa said quickly. "Dad was conservative. He would never—" "The debts are secured against the primary residential property," Mr. Reed continued, his voice measured. "The home on Maple Street was refinanced 3 times over the past decade." Eleanor blinked. "Refinanced? I didn't sign anything like that," she said, her voice small but steady. "You are listed as co-signatory on 2 of the refinancing documents," Mr. Reed answered. "Both notarized." Eleanor searched her memory. Papers signed at the kitchen counter. Documents slid toward her with yellow sticky notes marking where to initial. Harold explaining briefly that it was for tax efficiency. She had trusted him. Ryan's jaw tightened. "So what does that mean?" "It means," Mr. Reed said gently, "that creditors have legal claim to the property if the debt is not satisfied within 60 days. The room fell silent. Melissa stared at her mother. "Mom, how did you not know about this?" The question was not cruel, but it carried weight. Eleanor felt heat rise to her face. Your father handled the investments." Ryan exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. "Unbelievable." Mr. Reed continued outlining the timeline: formal notice, auction procedures, potential short sale scenarios. Words like liquidation and asset recovery drifted across the table. Eleanor looked down at her hands folded neatly in her lap. The gold band on her finger felt heavier than it had that morning. "So we could lose the house?" she asked quietly. "If the debt remains unpaid, yes." The drive home was silent. Ryan stared out the passenger window while Melissa tapped something into her phone. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as they pulled into the driveway. The house stood exactly as it had that morning. White siding, trimmed hedges, the maple tree swaying gently overhead. And Eleanor stepped inside and paused. The air felt different, not empty the way it had after Harold's passing, but exposed, as if invisible lines had been drawn through rooms she had once believed were solid. Atlas rose from his place near the front window and approached her, his tail moving slowly. He pressed his nose against her palm, then leaned into her hip. Ryan walked through the living room, glancing at the furniture. "If we have to sell quickly, we need to start organizing. We can't just sit on this." Melissa followed him into the dining room, already evaluating the china cabinet. Eleanor remained in the entryway, her gaze drifting toward the hallway that led to the bedroom she had shared with Harold for half a century. $460,000. Refinanced 3 times. Signed documents she barely remembered. The house had once felt permanent, anchored, safe. Now, standing in the fading light of late afternoon, Eleanor realized something had shifted beneath her feet. She wasn't just widowed. She was unmoored. Ryan returned to the entryway. "Mom, we need to figure out a plan. 60 days isn't long." 60 days. Atlas let out a low breath, and settled at her side again, eyes scanning the room as though he sensed something the rest of them did not. Eleanor ran her fingers along the edge of the hallway table Harold had built 30 years ago. The wood was smooth from decades of polishing, familiar, reliable, and yet, for the second time in a week, the thought crept quietly into her mind. This house no longer belonged to her, not in the way she had believed, not in the way she had trusted. And as dusk settled over Cedar Hollow, Eleanor Whitaker stood in her own living room and felt the foundation of 50 years begin to crack. The auction sign went up on a Thursday morning. Eleanor heard the thud of the wooden stake before she saw it. She was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing a coffee mug she hadn't finished, when a pickup truck pulled to the curb. Two men stepped out, efficient and polite, their movements practiced. One of them glanced at the house, then at the clipboard in his hand and nodded. Atlas was at the window before she was. He stood rigid, ears forward, a low rumble building deep in his chest. Not a bark, just a warning sound, steady and controlled. "It's all right," Eleanor murmured, though it wasn't. She stepped onto the front porch just as the younger of the two men pressed the sign into the lawn. Auction. Court-ordered sale. But the letters were bold and black against white plastic. Beneath it, a date exactly 56 days away. "Mrs. Whitaker?" the older man asked, removing his cap. "We'll need interior photos within the week. Standard procedure." She nodded. Her voice felt lodged somewhere behind her ribs. "Of course." They left as quickly as they had arrived. The truck rolled away, leaving the sign standing alone in the front yard, swaying slightly in the breeze. Atlas remained at her side, his eyes fixed on it, as if memorizing an enemy. Inside, the house felt smaller. Over the next few days, contractors began coming through, assessing, measuring, photographing. A young woman with a tablet walked room to room, narrating square footage into a headset. A man in steel-toed boots tapped along the baseboards, checking for moisture damage. Now Eleanor followed them politely, answering questions in a tone she barely recognized as her own. "Roof replaced in 2012. Furnace serviced last winter. Yes, original hardwood under the carpet." She had said those sentences before, proudly, when neighbors toured the house during holiday open houses. Now they sounded transactional, detached. Melissa began sorting boxes in the dining room, wrapping china in newspaper. Ryan spent most afternoons on the phone in the driveway, speaking in clipped tones about liquidation timelines and asset mitigation. "You can't drag this out, Mom," he said one evening, leaning against the kitchen counter. "The sooner we sell, the less we lose." "We?" Eleanor repeated quietly. He didn't seem to hear the word the way she meant it. Atlas had changed, but he no longer slept in the living room near Harold's recliner. Instead, he followed Eleanor from room to room, lying down only when she stopped moving. At night, he positioned himself at the foot of her bed, eyes open longer than usual, listening. The whispers began, not loud enough to be confrontational, just subtle shifts in tone when she walked into rooms. How could she not know? Dad trusted her with the house. She signed the documents. Eleanor folded Harold's sweaters one by one and placed them into cardboard boxes labeled "Donation." The scent of his cologne still lingered faintly in the fabric. She paused longer than necessary over a navy sweater with worn elbows. 50 winters he had owned that thing. "Mom," Melissa called from the hallway, "we need to decide what you're taking." Taking. The word struck her differently than selling or auctioning. It implied departure, finality. "I'll figure it out," Eleanor said. That night, after the house grew quiet and her children retreated to their old bedrooms, Eleanor sat alone at the kitchen table. The overhead light cast a pale circle across the wood surface, illuminating stacks of paperwork. Notices, legal disclosures, Timeline reminders. 60 days. Atlas rested his head on her knee. She ran her fingers through the thick fur at the back of his neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath her palm. "I should have known," she whispered, not sure who she was speaking to. Atlas lifted his head slightly, as if responding. She looked around the kitchen, the pale yellow walls she had painted herself, the curtains she had hemmed by hand, and the small dent in the cabinet door from when Ryan had thrown a baseball inside at age 9. Every mark in this house carried memory, and yet those memories were not listed anywhere in the appraisal report. The following week, strangers walked through her bedroom with measuring tapes. One of them opened the closet without asking. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched as he assessed the square footage of the life she had built. Atlas stepped between them, positioning himself squarely in front of her. Not aggressive, just present. "He's well trained," the man remarked. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "He is." On the 10th day after the sign went up, a neighbor stopped by under the pretense of returning a borrowed casserole dish. "I'm so sorry about all this," she said softly, her eyes flicking toward the front lawn. "Oh, it just doesn't seem right." Eleanor smiled politely. "Things happen." But inside, something had begun to shift. At night, she found herself replaying small moments from the past decade. Papers signed without reading carefully. Phone calls Harold had taken in the garage. Conversations that ended abruptly when she entered the room. Had there been signs? Atlas had started pacing occasionally in the evenings. Not anxious exactly, more restless. He would walk to the hallway, then back to the kitchen, then pause near the basement door before returning to her side. "Settle down," she told him gently one evening. He obeyed, lowering himself to the floor. But his gaze lingered toward the dark hallway longer than usual. By the 20th day, half the house was boxed. What the walls where framed photographs once hung showed faint outlines of cleaner paint. Empty hooks stood like small scars. Ryan placed a folder on the kitchen table. "Preliminary auction estimates," he said. "It won't cover everything." Eleanor didn't ask what everything meant anymore. When the house grew silent late that night, she walked slowly through each room, turning off lights one by one. The living room lamp clicked off. The hallway dimmed. Only the kitchen remained illuminated. She stood there, listening. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked steadily on the wall. Outside, the wind rustled through the maple leaves. Atlas rose from his place near the back door and walked toward the hallway again. He stopped near the basement entrance and looked back at her. Not whining, not barking, just waiting. Eleanor hesitated. "Oh, come on," she said softly. He didn't move. She felt it then. Not fear exactly, but something closer to awareness. A thin thread of doubt weaving itself through the certainty she had carried for 50 years. Harold had handled the numbers. Harold had refinanced the house. Harold had kept certain doors closed. The house was being prepared for strangers now. But there were parts of it she had never fully stepped into. Atlas's eyes remained fixed on her, steady and expectant. For the first time since the sign appeared in her yard, Eleanor felt something beyond humiliation and loss. She felt suspicion, and beneath that, the faintest tremor of a question she had never allowed herself to ask. What else had Harold kept from her? The basement door stood closed at the end of the hallway, silent and ordinary. Yet suddenly, while it no longer looked harmless, it looked unfinished. Atlas shifted his weight and let out a low breath. Eleanor stared at the door a moment longer before turning off the kitchen light. The house settled into darkness, but something inside it had begun to stir. Eleanor stood at the end of the hallway long after the lights were off, staring at the basement door. It was an ordinary door. White, slightly scuffed near the handle. She had painted it twice over the years. Once when the children were teenagers. Again 5 years ago, when Harold insisted the trim needed freshening up. And yet, in that moment, it felt like a boundary she had never fully crossed. Atlas remained still beside her, his gaze locked on the door. His ears twitched toward it, then toward her, then back again. "You're imagining things," she whispered to herself. But she wasn't sure. The basement had always been Harold's domain. He called it his utility space, a place for tools, electrical panels, seasonal storage. He'd installed additional shelving down there himself, claiming it would help with organization. Whenever she'd offered to sort through old boxes or reorganize the space, he'd smiled gently. "No need," he'd say. "It's a mess. You'd hate it down there." She had accepted that answer for decades. Now, standing in the quiet hallway, she felt something different pressing at her chest. Not grief, not humiliation, but a growing unease threaded with curiosity. Atlas shifted his weight and let out a soft whine. Eleanor reached for the knob. The metal felt cool beneath her fingers. She turned it slowly. The door opened with a faint creak, revealing the narrow wooden staircase descending into shadow. The air that rose from below carried a faint scent of dust and oil, familiar but distant, like a memory she hadn't revisited in years. She flipped the light switch at the top of the stairs. Nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. "Bulb must have burned out," she murmured. Atlas stepped forward, nose lifted, inhaling deeply. He began down the stairs before she could stop him. "Atlas, wait." But he moved carefully, deliberately, his large frame descending one step at a time. Eleanor followed, her hand sliding along the wall for balance. Halfway down, her foot brushed the pull chain for the secondary light fixture. She tugged it. A single overhead bulb flickered, then steadied, casting a dim yellow glow across the basement. The space was exactly as she remembered. Concrete floor, exposed beams, shelves lined with paint cans and toolboxes. A workbench stood against the far wall, neatly arranged despite a thin layer of dust. Harold had always been meticulous. Atlas moved toward the far corner, his nails clicking against the concrete. He lowered his head, sniffing along the base of the wall near an old steel shelving unit. "Come back," Eleanor said gently. He didn't. Instead, he began pacing in a tight circle near the back of the room. Not frantic, focused. Eleanor scanned the basement slowly. The electrical panel hung to her left. A stack of unused tiles leaned against the wall. The furnace hummed quietly near the center. Everything looked ordinary. Atlas returned to the same corner. He pressed his nose to the concrete floor near the base of the shelving unit and let out a low, insistent sound, half whine, half growl. Eleanor's pulse quickened. "What is it?" she asked, stepping closer. The concrete in that section looked slightly different. Not drastically, but enough that now that she noticed it, she couldn't unsee it. A faint shift in shade. A subtle outline barely visible beneath years of dust. She knelt slowly. Atlas stepped aside just enough for her to examine the surface. It was smooth, but not quite like the surrounding floor. The texture seemed newer, as if it had been patched long after the rest had cured. Her mind searched backward through decades. Had Harold ever mentioned repairs? Foundation work? Plumbing? She couldn't recall. "Settle," she whispered. "She won't," though her own heartbeat was anything but settled. Atlas lowered himself slightly, but his eyes never left the patch of concrete. Eleanor stood and walked to the workbench. Harold's toolbox sat exactly where he had left it. Red metal, edges worn from years of use. She opened it slowly. Inside, tools lay organized in perfect rows, wrenches polished, screwdrivers aligned by size. A small pry bar rested along the side compartment. Her fingers hovered over it. "What were you keeping from me?" she murmured softly, not accusing, just searching. The overhead bulb flickered faintly. She returned to the corner. The shelving unit above the patched area held old paint cans and a small wooden crate. She moved them aside carefully, revealing more of the floor beneath. The outline became clearer, a faint rectangular shape roughly 2 feet wide. Atlas rose again and placed one large paw directly over the center of it. Eleanor stared. For 50 years, she had trusted the boundaries Harold set. Certain rooms were his. Certain decisions were his. She had never felt excluded, only reassured. But now, kneeling on the cold basement floor, she felt something else begin to take root. Suspicion. Not loud, not angry, just steady. Atlas scratched lightly at the edge of the patch, his claws scraping against concrete with a soft, grating sound. "Enough," she said quickly, placing her hand on his collar. He stopped, but his body remained tense. Eleanor ran her fingers along the seam again. There it was, a hairline crack tracing the outline like a faint scar. She rose slowly, wiping dust from her hands. The house above them felt distant, hollow. Her children slept upstairs, and unaware she was down here. The auction sign stood outside in the dark, marking days on a countdown she had never chosen. Atlas remained planted beside the concrete patch, guarding it like something valuable. Eleanor looked around the basement one last time. This room had never felt like hers. Tonight, for the first time, she wondered if it ever truly had been his either. She turned off the overhead bulb and climbed the stairs, Atlas following closely behind. At the top, she paused once more before closing the door. Her hand lingered on the knob. The house above remained silent, but now she knew something she hadn't known before. There was more to this place than debts and paperwork, and whatever it was, Atlas had found it. She closed the basement door gently. As the unease that had settled into her bones days ago had shifted shape, it was no longer helpless. It was watching, waiting. Eleanor barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faint rectangle in the basement floor. She heard the soft scrape of Atlas's claws against concrete. The image replayed with unsettling clarity. At 3:17 a.m., she gave up pretending. Atlas lifted his head the moment her feet touched the bedroom floor. He did not stretch or yawn. He simply stood, alert, as if he had been expecting her. "You too?" she whispered. He followed her down the hallway without hesitation. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the hallway clock. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with something unspoken. Eleanor paused at the basement door again, as her hand hovered over the knob. For 50 years, she had allowed this door to remain a boundary. Tonight, she was done respecting it. She turned the knob. The staircase descended into shadow once more. She tugged the overhead pull chain. The bulb flickered, then steadied, casting that same tired yellow glow across the concrete. Atlas moved first. He went directly to the far corner. No pacing this time, no circling. Straight to the patched section of floor near the steel shelving unit. He lowered his nose and let out a soft, urgent sound. "I see it," Eleanor said quietly. She had brought Harold's toolbox with her this time. The red metal box felt heavier in her hands than it had the night before. She set it on the workbench and opened it slowly. The smell of oil and metal rose faintly. Inside, and everything remained in perfect order. Her fingers brushed the pry bar again. This time, she picked it up. Her hands trembled, not violently, but enough that she had to steady her grip before kneeling beside the patch. Atlas stepped back slightly, watching her. The concrete felt colder now. She pressed the edge of the pry bar along the faint seam she had noticed earlier. It took effort to find the exact line, but once she did, she felt the subtle give beneath the surface. She applied pressure. Nothing. She shifted position and tried again. A faint crack echoed through the basement. She froze. The sound had not been loud, but in the stillness of the house, it felt enormous. Atlas stiffened. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "It's just concrete," she murmured. She pressed harder. A small chip broke loose near the edge of the patch. A dust scattered across the floor. Beneath it, the texture changed. Not solid foundation. Metal. Her breath caught. She cleared more of the chipped concrete away with shaking fingers. The faint outline sharpened into something undeniable. A welded steel edge beneath the thin cement layer. This wasn't a repair. It was a cover. Atlas stepped forward again, placing one paw firmly against the surface as if confirming it. Eleanor shifted the shelving unit slightly to expose the full shape. It was heavier than she expected, but years of moving furniture and managing a household gave her more strength than anyone realized. When the shelves cleared, the rectangle revealed itself fully. A steel hatch embedded into the foundation, flush with the floor, deliberate. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "What did you do, Harold?" she whispered. She ran her fingers along the metal edge. It was cool and smooth, the weld seams carefully finished. There was no visible handle, just a small recessed lip barely wide enough for her fingertips. Atlas let out a low breath, almost impatient. Eleanor braced herself and wedged the pry bar into the narrow gap. She pulled. The metal resisted at first, then gave with a sharp, hollow clang. The hatch lifted slightly, revealing darkness beneath. A rush of stale air rose from the opening, cool and dry. She widened the gap and pulled again, straining with both hands. The hatch opened fully. Beneath it was a narrow cavity built into the foundation. Inside rested a waterproof lockbox. It was not large, about the size of a briefcase. Matte black, sealed tight. For a long moment, Eleanor simply stared at it. Yet the basement light hummed faintly overhead. Dust floated lazily in the beam. Atlas leaned forward, sniffing the air above the cavity. She reached down slowly and lifted the lockbox from its hiding place. It was heavier than it looked. Her heart hammered so hard she felt slightly lightheaded. She set it carefully on the basement floor and closed the hatch halfway, not enough to seal it, just enough to steady herself. The lockbox had a combination dial and a small key slot beneath it. Of course it did. Eleanor sat back on her heels staring at it. 50 years of marriage. 50 years of shared bank accounts, shared meals, shared holidays. And beneath her own home, Harold had hidden something that required both a key and a code. Atlas lowered himself beside her, his head resting lightly against her thigh. The house above remained silent. Ryan and Melissa were still asleep upstairs, unaware of what sat at their mother's knees. Eleanor placed her hand flat against the top of the lockbox. It felt real, solid, intentional. This wasn't neglect. It wasn't oversight. It was design. Her mind raced backward. Every time Harold had insisted on handling paperwork alone, every quiet phone call in the garage, every moment he had closed this basement door behind him. She didn't feel anger. Not yet. What she felt was something far more unsettling. Recognition. Atlas lifted his head slightly, meeting her gaze. "You knew," she said softly to him. He blinked once. Some distant memory surfaced. Harold kneeling in this very basement years ago, teaching Atlas simple scent commands when he was still a young dog, not laughing when the pup found hidden objects tucked behind boxes. "Good boy," Harold would say. Atlas had always been sharp, and now, somehow, he had remembered. Eleanor looked back down at the lockbox. Above them, the first faint hint of dawn began to press against the basement windows. She was no longer simply a widow preparing to lose her home. She was standing at the edge of something far larger. The fear that had gripped her for weeks had shifted again. This time, it was edged with adrenaline. Atlas rose slowly and stood beside her as she carried the lockbox to the workbench. Whatever was inside it, Harold had meant for it to stay hidden. Until now. And for the first time since the auction sign pierced her lawn, Eleanor Whitaker felt something that did not resemble helplessness. She felt the sharp and electric surge of discovery. The basement bulb flickered faintly overhead, casting long shadows across the workbench. Eleanor stood motionless for a moment, staring at the black lockbox resting in front of her. It looked ordinary, industrial, practical. Harold had always preferred practical things. Atlas stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against her calf. His gaze never left the box. "Let's see what you wanted me to find," she whispered. She turned the lockbox slowly in her hands. The combination dial caught the light. The small key slot beneath it seemed almost symbolic, 2 layers of protection. Her eyes drifted back toward Harold's toolbox. If there had been a key, where would he have kept it? She opened the toolbox again, running her fingers through the compartments more carefully this time. Beneath a tray of neatly arranged sockets, she noticed a narrow, false bottom she had never seen before. It lifted easily. Inside lay a small brass key. Her breath left her in a slow exhale. "Of course," she murmured. She returned to the lockbox and inserted the key. It turned smoothly. 1 barrier down, the combination dial remained. Eleanor stared at the numbers. Harold had not been sentimental about many things, but there were certain dates he never forgot. She tried the simplest first. Their wedding anniversary. 517. The dial clicked softly. Nothing. She reset it. Harold's birth date. Still nothing. Atlas shifted slightly, his claws clicking against the concrete. She closed her eyes and forced herself to think clearly. 15 years ago. But the letter inside, if there was a letter, would likely be dated around the time this had been sealed. What had happened 15 years ago? Ryan's promotion? Melissa's second marriage? No. Her mind drifted back further. 15 years ago had been the year Harold retired from active consulting. It had also been the year he took Atlas to those training sessions in the basement, small scent drills he treated almost like a game. 3-7, she whispered. March 7th. The day Harold officially closed his office. She turned the dial carefully. 370. A pause. Then a soft click. The lid loosened. Eleanor lifted it slowly. Inside, the contents were organized in neat layers, exactly as Harold would have arranged them. On top lay a thick envelope sealed with her name written across it, in Harold's precise, steady handwriting. Home Eleanor. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. Beneath the envelope rested several manila folders secured with metal clasps. A stack of legal documents bound together with a thick black clip. At the bottom, what looked like property deeds folded carefully inside protective sleeves. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She set the envelope aside for the moment and reached for the legal packet first. The top page bore a county seal she did not recognize. Morgan County, Ohio. Her eyes scanned the document slowly. Warranty deed. Grantee. Eleanor Margaret Whitaker. Sole ownership. 120 acres of undeveloped woodland property located 15 miles outside Cedar Hollow. She read it twice, then a third time. The property had been deeded to her 15 years ago. Not jointly, not in trust with Harold, solely in her name. Her throat tightened. She flipped through the next pages. Tax records, paid annually. A trust account established for maintenance and property tax obligations. Fully funded and active. Every year, without her knowledge. She set the deed down carefully, her mind racing. The suburban house on Maple Street, the one now marked for auction, was not listed anywhere in this packet. Instead, detailed documentation showed refinancing structures that isolated the house as the primary collateral asset while separating other holdings legally beyond reach of creditors. She felt the floor beneath her knees shift, not physically, but in perception. The visible house had been leveraged, but it had not been the only property. It had never been the core asset. She reached for the envelope with her name on it, while Atlas sat quietly beside her, steady and watchful. Eleanor broke the seal. Inside was a letter dated 15 years earlier. Her eyes moved over Harold's handwriting, slower this time. He explained that several infrastructure projects he had co-financed with his business partner, Victor Langford, had begun showing irregularities. Funds diverted, accounts mismatched. He had discovered evidence of internal embezzlement. Rather than confront it publicly and risk immediate financial ruin, Harold had quietly transferred certain personal assets into Eleanor's sole ownership. The woodland property had been purchased and secured under her name. The trust had been funded to protect it from future claims, and he had structured visible debts around the Maple Street house intentionally to shield the woodland asset from seizure should litigation arise. He had never told her because the investigation was ongoing. Exposure at the wrong time could have triggered legal retaliation before he had sufficient proof. "I never wanted you pulled into it," the letter read. "If you're reading this, then something happened before I could finish what I started." Eleanor lowered the page slowly. 15 years. For 15 years, she had believed the house on Maple Street represented their stability. In truth, it had been a shield, a decoy. Atlas leaned closer, nudging her elbow gently. "You remembered," she said softly to him, while she thought back to those afternoons in the basement when Harold would hide small objects beneath boxes and command Atlas to find them. The dog would sniff carefully, nose close to the floor, until he located the prize. Harold had moved the lockbox once during a minor foundation repair. He must have allowed Atlas to scent it then. Dogs remembered what people forgot. Eleanor looked back at the deed in her hands. 120 acres. Untouched. Protected. Her name. Shock moved through her in waves. Not panic, not fear, but something heavier. Something closer to disbelief. She had not been left with nothing. She had been left with something hidden beneath. The auction sign on the lawn no longer felt like a death sentence. It felt incomplete. Atlas settled beside her again, as she carefully stacked the documents back into the lockbox. The basement light hummed softly overhead. Morning light began filtering faintly through the small window near the ceiling. The house above them still faced foreclosure. The debts were real. But the foundation of her future no longer rested solely on Maple Street. Eleanor closed the lockbox gently. For weeks, she had felt erased. Now she understood something else entirely. Harold had not been reckless. He had been strategic. And whatever came next. She was no longer standing on hollow ground. The basement felt different now. Not like a place she had avoided for decades, but like a room that had finally spoken. Eleanor sat back on the cold concrete floor, the lockbox resting against her knees. Atlas lay beside her, steady and calm, as if his work for the night had been completed. She unfolded Harold's letter again. The paper trembled slightly in her hands, not from fear this time, but from the weight of understanding settling in. Harold's handwriting was firm, deliberate. He wrote about Victor Langford in measured sentences. No anger, no dramatic accusations, just facts. They had built Whitaker-Langford infrastructure together 30 years ago. They had secured municipal bridge contracts throughout central Ohio. They had trusted each other. Until Harold began noticing discrepancies, invoices that didn't match subcontractor reports, Transfers routed through secondary accounts, project budgets that ballooned without explanation. I tried to believe it was oversight, he wrote. Oh, but the numbers never lie. Eleanor could see him now, late at night at the kitchen table. Spreadsheets spread across the wood surface, glasses perched low on his nose. She had assumed he was managing retirement accounts. Instead, he had been tracing fraud. Harold wrote that when he confronted Victor quietly, the response was calm but cold. Victor denied everything. But within weeks, Harold noticed pressure building around him. Subtle threats, legal language about partnership liabilities, hints that if any audit went public, all co-signatories, including spouses, could be drawn into civil claims. That's when I made my decision, Harold's letter continued. I would not allow you to be collateral damage. Eleanor swallowed hard. Though he described purchasing the woodland property through a separate entity before transferring it solely into her name. He established a protected trust for tax and maintenance. He structured refinancing around Maple Street to isolate visible assets from protected ones. I needed Victor to believe everything was tied to the house, Harold wrote. If litigation ever came, it would strike what he could see, not what mattered. Her chest tightened. He had been playing defense for 15 years. He had continued collecting documentation quietly, copies of bank statements, contractor invoices, email records printed and sealed in the lower folders of the lockbox. Eleanor set the letter aside and opened one of the manila folders. Inside were neatly labeled copies of financial statements highlighting discrepancies in red ink. Dates circled, his notes in Harold's handwriting. Mismatch, $42K. Duplicate routing. Unaccounted transfer. Another folder contained printed email chains between Harold and Victor. The tone shifted subtly over time, from cooperative to clipped to cautious. The final document in the stack was a drafted affidavit, unsigned. Harold had been preparing something, but he hadn't finished. Atlas shifted and rested his head against her shoulder. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know you were fighting something. Her voice echoed faintly against the concrete walls. The shock she had felt moments earlier softened into something more complicated. Grief, yes, but threaded with understanding. She remembered the nights Harold had closed himself in the garage, the tension in his shoulders when certain phone calls came in, and the way he'd brushed off her questions with gentle reassurances. It's business, he would say. Nothing for you to worry about. She had believed him, not because she was naive, but because she trusted the man she had shared a life with. The refinancing of Maple Street suddenly looked different in her mind. Not recklessness. Camouflage. Harold had taken a risk, placing visible strain on their primary home to shield what he believed would secure her future. He had never told her, not because he doubted her, but because he was trying to protect her. Eleanor lowered the papers slowly and closed her eyes. For weeks, she had replayed memories searching for signs of deception. Now, those same memories rearranged themselves. Harold had not been distant. He had been burdened. She leaned back against the cool basement wall, letting the weight of it settle fully. 15 years of quiet vigilance. 15 years of carrying a secret she had never known existed. Atlas lifted his head and looked at her, eyes steady and dark. You found it, she said softly, and she knew that wasn't coincidence. Harold had trained Atlas in scent work during that very year, teaching him to locate hidden objects beneath boxes, behind shelves. Eleanor had laughed at the time, teasing that her husband was turning their dog into a detective. Now she understood. Harold had moved the lockbox temporarily during minor foundation repairs years ago. Atlas would have scented it then. The metal, the oil, the faint smell of sealed paper. Dogs remembered what humans overlooked. Atlas had not been restless for no reason. He had remembered. Eleanor stood slowly, as gathering the documents back into the lockbox with deliberate care. The basement no longer felt like forbidden territory. It felt like a vault she had finally been given access to. Above her, the house remained quiet. The auction date still loomed. The debts tied to Maple Street were still real. But the narrative had shifted. She climbed the stairs with Atlas at her side, carrying the lockbox carefully against her chest. At the top, she paused and glanced back down at the basement. For 50 years, she had believed stability meant shared knowledge. Now she understood that sometimes love expressed itself in silence. Not perfect silence, not flawless decisions, but protection carried alone. She closed the basement door gently and carried the lockbox into the kitchen. As morning light filtered through the curtains she had sewn decades ago, the maple tree outside swayed as it always had. Ryan's bedroom door creaked faintly down the hall. Life above ground continued as though nothing had changed. But everything had. Eleanor set the lockbox on the kitchen table and placed her hand flat against its lid. The humiliation she had felt at the estate office had not vanished. The house was still scheduled for auction. But beneath the surface of it all, beneath concrete, beneath paperwork, beneath decades of quiet trust, Harold had built something stronger than appearances. Her grief shifted again, not erased, but steadied. She picked up the letter once more and read the final line carefully. "If I couldn't finish it, I trust you will know what to do." Eleanor folded the paper slowly, and for the first time since Harold's death, she did not feel abandoned inside her own life. She felt entrusted, and the difference changed everything. But entrusted with what? The kitchen clock ticked steadily as Eleanor sat at the table, the lockbox closed in front of her. The sun had risen fully now, light pouring across the hardwood floor. Upstairs, she heard the faint sound of Melissa moving around, a shower running, closet doors sliding open. Life continued as if nothing monumental had shifted beneath the house overnight. Eleanor ran her fingers along the edge of Harold's letter again. "If I couldn't finish it, I trust you will know what to do." She had spent 50 years making decisions with someone else, choosing paint colors together, deciding where to vacation, agreeing on how much to spend on repairs, and even arguments had been shared. This decision was hers alone. Atlas lay at her feet, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. His presence felt less like comfort now, and more like quiet reinforcement. She gathered the documents carefully and slid them back into the lockbox. Then she carried it to the hall closet and placed it behind a stack of winter coats. Not hidden the way Harold had hidden it, but protected for the moment. By 9 o'clock, Ryan was seated at the kitchen table with his laptop open. "I've spoken to a realtor who specializes in court-ordered sales," he said, scrolling through a spreadsheet. "If we move fast, we can limit how much the deficit spills over." Melissa leaned against the counter. "We need to be realistic." Eleanor poured coffee slowly, listening. Realistic. She set the mug down gently. I have an appointment today," she said. Ryan looked up. "With who?" "The estate attorney." Melissa frowned slightly. "About what?" "There's nothing to negotiate, Mom. The debt is documented." "About other matters," Eleanor replied calmly. Ryan exchanged a glance with his sister. The attorney's office felt different this time. Clara Mendez, a younger associate in Thomas Reed's firm, welcomed Eleanor into her office with a measured expression. Clara had dark hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that missed very little. "You mentioned new documentation?" Clara asked, as Eleanor placed the lockbox on the desk. "Yes." Eleanor opened it carefully and slid the deed across the polished wood surface. Clara adjusted her glasses and read silently. Her brows lifted almost immediately. "This is recorded," she said, scanning the seal. Oh, filed 15 years ago. Yes. In your name only. Yes. Clara flipped through the trust documents next, her movements growing more deliberate with each page. This trust is fully funded, property taxes paid annually, maintenance account active. Eleanor remained silent. Clara leaned back slightly in her chair. Mrs. Whitaker, this changes things. The words felt almost unreal. How? Eleanor asked quietly. The Maple Street property is still subject to creditor claims, Clara explained. But this woodland property legally separate. It's insulated. And the documentation regarding Victor Langford. Clara's eyes sharpened. You have copies of financial discrepancies, email correspondence, an unsigned affidavit. She paused. If these records are accurate, your husband was building a fraud case. Eleanor nodded slowly, as Clara closed the folder and folded her hands. We would need forensic accounting review, but if substantiated, it could reopen scrutiny on Mr. Langford. It may shift liability away from your husband's estate. Eleanor felt her pulse steady. So I don't have to sell the woodland property? No, Clara said firmly. That asset is yours. No creditor has claim to it. Outside the window, traffic moved along Main Street as it always did. People walked by unaware that Eleanor's world had tilted again, this time not downward, but outward. When she returned home, Ryan was waiting in the driveway. What was so urgent? He asked. Eleanor stepped out of the car slowly. There's another property, she said. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as she explained. Oh, 120 acres? Melissa repeated later that evening. Dad never mentioned anything like that. He didn't, Eleanor replied. Ryan ran a hand through his hair. We could sell it and clear everything. Start fresh. That's the smart move. The word smart landed heavily. Eleanor looked toward the backyard where Atlas stood near the fence, scanning the quiet neighborhood. For the first time since the auction notice, she felt a choice forming in front of her. Sell the woodland property and erase the debt quickly, or hold it, finish what Harold had started. That night, sleep did not come easily. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of the streetlight casting shadows across the room. Atlas slept on the floor beside her, breathing steady. Her mind replayed Clara's words. It changes things. But change required action. Harold had gathered evidence quietly. He had prepared documentation. He had trusted her to decide whether to use it. The woodland property represented security, but the fraud documents represented accountability. Those were not the same thing. Atlas stirred and lifted his head slightly. You think I should fight? She asked softly. He blinked once, then lowered his head again. Eleanor closed her eyes. For decades, she had deferred to Harold when it came to numbers and legal matters. Not because she couldn't understand, but because she believed partnership meant dividing responsibilities. Now partnership meant stepping forward alone. Morning came slowly. She rose before dawn and walked to the backyard with Atlas. The grass was damp with dew. The auction sign stood visible beyond the maple tree. Oh, she imagined the woodland property. Trees untouched, land quiet and wide. A place no one in Cedar Hollow had ever associated with her. It was hers, but it was also evidence of something larger. When she returned inside, she picked up the phone and dialed Clara's office. I want to proceed, she said when Clara answered. Review the financial documents, quietly. There was a pause on the other end. All right, Clara replied. We'll begin. Eleanor hung up slowly. The fear that had defined the past weeks had shifted into something steadier. Not reckless, not impulsive. Determined. Atlas moved to stand beside her, pressing lightly against her leg. For the first time in 50 years, the direction of her life was not shared. It was chosen. and she chose to fight. The call came 3 days later, and Eleanor was in the kitchen folding dish towels when her cell phone buzzed against the counter. The number was unfamiliar. Cleveland area code. She let it ring twice before answering. "Mrs. Whitaker," a smooth voice said, measured and confident. "This is Victor Langford." The name settled into the room like a draft of cold air. Atlas, who had been lying near the back door, lifted his head immediately. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "I understand you've been reviewing some historical documents," Victor continued. His tone was cordial, almost friendly. "I was hoping we might speak before any misunderstandings escalate." Misunderstandings? Eleanor glanced toward the hallway where Harold's old briefcase still sat near the coat rack. "I'm not sure there's anything to misunderstand," she said. And a soft chuckle came through the receiver. "Business matters are rarely simple. Harold and I had complex arrangements. Paperwork can look misleading without context." Eleanor felt her pulse rise, but she kept her voice even. "Is that why you refinanced my home into foreclosure territory?" she asked quietly. A pause. "Harold made his own financial decisions," Victor replied. "We were both invested in certain infrastructure projects. Risk is part of growth." "Embezzlement isn't risk," she said. Silence, then a shift in tone, still calm, but less polished. "I would advise caution," Victor said. "Dragging old matters into public forums won't serve anyone, especially not you. Litigation can be expensive." The implication was clear. Atlas rose and moved closer, pressing his shoulder against Eleanor's leg. I'll let my attorney respond," she said. Victor exhaled slowly. "There's no need to involve lawyers unnecessarily. I'm prepared to discuss a private settlement. Quietly. For everyone's benefit." "For whose benefit?" she asked. Another pause. "Mrs. Whitaker," Victor said, the friendliness now thinning. "Your husband and I built something substantial together. You don't want to dismantle that legacy based on partial information." "My husband built something," Eleanor replied. "You just took from it." She ended the call. The kitchen felt charged after the line went dead. Atlas stood beside her, alert and protective. That afternoon, Clara Mendez called with an update. "Our preliminary review supports your husband's documentation," she said. "There are irregular fund transfers consistent with misappropriation. If we move forward, it will reopen scrutiny on Mr. Langford's prior contracts." "And the debt tied to Maple Street?" Eleanor asked. "If the fraud claim holds, liability shifts significantly," Clara explained. "It could invalidate a portion of the refinancing structure." Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "So he thought he'd buried it?" "Yes," Clara said, "and he likely believed the estate wouldn't challenge it." Victor had assumed grief would paralyze her, that humiliation would silence her, that the auction sign would mark the end. Instead, it had marked the beginning. Over the next week, investigators began requesting archived financial records. Clara coordinated forensic accounting reviews. Eleanor signed documents she actually read this time, each signature deliberate. Ryan noticed the shift immediately. "What are you doing?" he asked one evening, standing in the living room as Eleanor sorted through additional paperwork. "This could drag on for years." "Maybe," she replied calmly. "We could just sell the woodland property," he pressed. "Clear everything. Walk away." Eleanor met her son's eyes. "Walk away from what?" she asked. He didn't answer. Melissa remained quieter, watching her mother more closely than before. There was something in Eleanor's posture now, something firmer. Days later, a certified letter arrived addressed to Eleanor from a law firm in Cleveland. Atlas barked once when the mail carrier approached the door. Eleanor opened the envelope at the kitchen table. It was a formal request to cease defamatory accusations regarding Victor Langford's business practices. Clara read it over the phone. "Oh, standard intimidation," she said. "It's meant to scare you." "It won't," Eleanor replied. That night, she drove past Maple Street slowly before pulling into the driveway. The auction sign loomed in the fading light. Neighbors across the street pretended not to stare. For weeks, that sign had felt like a symbol of defeat. Now it looked different, temporary. Inside, the house was half-packed. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway walls. The emptiness echoed more loudly than before. Atlas walked ahead of her into the living room and sat near the front window, watching the street. "Do you think he's nervous?" she asked him softly. The German shepherd blinked once, ears tilting slightly. Victor Langford had likely believed the lockbox would remain buried beneath concrete indefinitely. He had underestimated two things: Harold's documentation and a dog's memory. 2 days later, news reached Clara's office that a preliminary inquiry had been opened into Whitaker Langford Infrastructure's past municipal contracts. Victor called again. This time, Eleanor didn't answer. He left a voicemail. "Mrs. Whitaker, I urge you to reconsider this path. Public scrutiny benefits no one." She deleted it. Instead, she drove out toward Morgan County for the first time. The woodland property lay 15 miles beyond Cedar Hollow, down a narrow county road lined with tall oaks and open fields. The entrance was marked only by a rusted gate and a small weathered sign with a parcel number. She stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply. The land stretched wide and quiet, trees dense and untouched. Sunlight filtered through leaves in shifting patterns across the forest floor. Atlas bounded ahead, his aging body suddenly energized, moving with purpose through open grass. Eleanor stood at the edge of the property and let the silence settle around her. Victor believed he had already won. He believed Maple Street represented the totality of her world. He did not know about this. He did not know that beneath the visible debt, Harold had built something protected. The wind moved gently through the trees. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. The fear that once dominated her had evolved into something else: resolve. When she returned to Cedar Hollow that evening, she carried that quiet certainty with her. Victor Langford had thought the concrete would never crack. He had thought the widow would remain silent, yet he had thought the story ended with foreclosure. He was wrong. And for the first time since Harold's death, Eleanor Whitaker felt not just determined, but ready. The shift did not come with fireworks. It came quietly, through paperwork and patience. Within 2 weeks, Clara called with news that changed the legal landscape. The preliminary inquiry into Whitaker Langford Infrastructure had expanded. Investigators had subpoenaed archived financial records from the municipal contracts Harold once managed. "Victor is cooperating," Clara said over the phone, her tone measured, but not comfortably. Eleanor stood in the half-empty living room as she listened. The walls were bare now. Only faint outlines marked where family photographs once hung. "And Maple Street?" Eleanor asked. "There's movement," Clara replied. "If misappropriation is substantiated, your husband's liability exposure decreases significantly. The refinancing tied to those projects could be reevaluated." Eleanor let the words settle. Decrease significantly. It didn't mean reversal. It didn't mean cancellation. But it meant the narrative was shifting. Ryan paced near the window while she relayed the update. "So what does that mean?" he asked. "The auction's still scheduled." "Yes," Eleanor replied calmly. "For now." Melissa folded her arms. "Mom, you're gambling on a long investigation." Eleanor met her daughter's eyes. "I'm correcting something," she said. The auction day arrived under a gray sky. Neighbors gathered at a respectful distance as potential buyers walked through the house one final time. The hardwood floors shone, the kitchen counters gleamed, and Eleanor stood near the back door with Atlas at her side, observing without flinching. The house that had once symbolized her life now felt like a chapter closing. Not an ending, a closing. The bidding began in the front yard. Numbers were called out briskly, hands lifted. A final offer settled the sale below its appraised value, but high enough to satisfy most immediate creditor claims. Ryan exhaled heavily. "It's done." Eleanor nodded. It was done. Later that afternoon, Clara called again. "There's been a development," she said. "The forensic review uncovered direct transfer discrepancies. Victor's legal team has shifted posture." "How so?" "They're negotiating." Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her kitchen table, for what might be the last time. Atlas rested beneath her chair, calm. "Negotiating what?" she asked. "Oh, a settlement framework, acknowledging misappropriated funds. If finalized, it would reallocate liability from your husband's estate." In other words, Harold's name would no longer sit at the center of the collapse. Victor Langford, who once spoke with polished ease, now faced documented scrutiny. Eleanor felt neither triumph nor bitterness, only clarity. Within a month, formal charges related to financial misrepresentation were filed against Victor through civil proceedings. His assets were reviewed, his partnerships dissected publicly in ways he had likely hoped to avoid. Clara handled each step carefully. "The woodland property remains untouched," she reassured Eleanor during one meeting. "Fully insulated." The Maple Street house officially transferred ownership 2 weeks later. On moving day, Eleanor stood on the front porch one last time. The maple tree rustled gently above her. Atlas sat beside her, ears forward. She did not cry. Instead, she ran her hand along the porch railing Harold had once sanded smooth on a summer afternoon decades ago. "Thank you," she whispered, not to the house but to the years it had held. Ryan approached with the final box. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she replied. They drove away without looking back. The woodland property in Morgan County waited. The gravel road leading to it felt narrower than she remembered. When she unlocked the rusted gate and drove onto the land, Atlas leapt from the car before she could even close the door. He ran through the tall grass with surprising energy, circling wide before returning to her side. The farmhouse near the tree line was modest, weathered, structurally sound but neglected. Its porch sagged slightly at one corner, windows clouded with dust. Eleanor stepped inside slowly. The air smelled of wood and quiet. She set her boxes down in the center of the empty living room and stood still. No auction sign, no whispered neighbors, no ticking clock counting down 60 days, just space. Space she owned. Over the next few weeks, she began small renovations, cleaning windows, repairing the porch steps, airing out rooms long closed. Ryan visited once to inspect the property lines. Melissa brought curtains and cleaning supplies. Their tone had shifted. There was less urgency now, less assumption. Victor's legal standing weakened steadily as investigations progressed. The refinancing structure that once pinned liability squarely on Harold's estate fractured under scrutiny. Maple Street was gone, but Harold's name was no longer burdened by deception. One afternoon, Eleanor stood at the edge of the woodland, watching Atlas move through a basic scent trail she had laid earlier that morning, using one of Harold's old gloves. "Find it," she said softly. Atlas lowered his head and followed the path carefully through brush and leaves until he located the hidden object beneath a log. He sat proudly beside it. Eleanor smiled. The instinct Harold had nurtured in him years ago now felt like inheritance. The woman who once felt erased inside her own home now stood on open land, making deliberate choices without hesitation. She was no longer reacting. She was building. And as the sun dipped behind the trees that evening, Eleanor Whitaker stood alone on her own property for the first time in her life, not as someone's wife, not as someone's dependent, but as someone who had stepped fully into her own ground. The first night in the farmhouse was quieter than she expected. No distant traffic, no neighbor's porch light flicking on across the street, only wind moving through tall trees and the faint creak of wood adjusting to temperature. Atlas slept near the front door, his body positioned instinctively between Eleanor and the outside world. The house was modest, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with wide windows that faced the eastern tree line. Dust floated in angled shafts of morning light the next day as Eleanor opened curtains. She had washed and ironed herself. She moved slowly, deliberately. There was no urgency here. She began with simple repairs, sanding the porch railings, replacing rusted hinges, scrubbing years of neglect from kitchen cabinets. Her hands ached by evening, but it was a clean ache, the kind that came from effort rather than fear. Ryan visited once, driving out in his pickup truck and stepping onto the gravel with cautious curiosity. "It's bigger than I imagined," he admitted, surveying the land. Eleanor nodded. "Your father chose it carefully." Ryan ran his hands along the porch railing she had refinished. "You're really staying?" he asked. "Yes." He hesitated. "I didn't think you'd fight like that." She met his eyes evenly. "Neither did I." Melissa came the following weekend with a trunk full of bedding and potted plants. "It needs color," she said, through setting geraniums along the porch. They worked side by side that afternoon, not speaking much. The tension that had once threaded their conversations had softened into something quieter. Not fully healed, but open. Atlas followed Melissa around the yard, occasionally nudging her hand as if reintroducing himself to this version of their lives. Within weeks, the farmhouse felt lived in. Eleanor found Harold's old scent training equipment in one of the lockbox folders, notes he had written about canine tracking drills, diagrams of scent patterns, small reminders in the margins. Atlas responded eagerly when she began laying trails in the woodland clearing. His movements grew more focused. His age seemed to recede when he worked. One morning, while watching him track a hidden glove through tall grass, an idea settled gently into place. Cedar Hollow had a volunteer search and rescue unit that often relied on neighboring counties for canine assistance. She remembered reading about it in the local paper years ago. She called the county coordinator that afternoon. "I have experience with scent training," she explained, "and a German shepherd who's proven he remembers more than most people." There was a pause on the other end. "We're always open to volunteers," the coordinator replied cautiously. "Training standards are strict." "I wouldn't expect less," Eleanor said. The first evaluation took place on a crisp Saturday morning. A handful of volunteers gathered near the woodland edge. Atlas stood alert but calm beside her. "Age?" one trainer asked. 10, Eleanor answered. The trainer raised a brow. That's senior for field work." "He still tracks," she replied simply. They ran controlled scent exercises across uneven terrain. Atlas followed each trail with unwavering focus, ignoring distractions. His movements were measured, disciplined. When he located the final marker hidden beneath a fallen log, he sat quietly and looked back at Eleanor. The trainer nodded slowly. "He's solid," he admitted. Eleanor felt something expand in her chest. Not pride in herself, but pride in what Harold had begun and Atlas had carried forward. Word spread quietly through Morgan County that a widow had moved onto the old woodland parcel and started scent drills in her clearing. Some neighbors stopped by out of curiosity. Others brought coffee and homemade pie. But they asked questions, not about foreclosure or scandal, but about training techniques and property boundaries. The isolation she had feared never materialized. Instead, connection formed differently here, based on presence rather than history. Victor Langford's legal situation continued unfolding quietly in the background. Settlements were negotiated, documentation sealed. His public confidence faded into cautious appearances and limited statements. Eleanor no longer followed the updates obsessively. That chapter had shifted. One evening, as she sat on the farmhouse porch watching Atlas rest in the tall grass, she realized something subtle but undeniable. The woman who once measured her days by someone else's schedule now woke each morning with her own plans. She repaired fencing. She coordinated volunteer drills. She replanted a vegetable patch near the tree line. Her children visited more often, not out of obligation, but curiosity. They asked her opinion before making their own decisions. The dynamic had changed, not because she demanded it, but because she stood differently. Atlas aged visibly as the months passed, his muzzle grayer, his gait slightly slower. But when called to work, his eyes sharpened just as they had in the basement. One afternoon, after completing a successful volunteer exercise with the county team, Eleanor knelt beside him and ran her hand along his back. "You remembered what was hidden beneath," she whispered. Atlas leaned into her touch. The farmhouse porch light glowed softly that evening as dusk settled over the trees. Wind moved gently across the open land, carrying the scent of pine and soil. But for the first time in 50 years, Eleanor did not feel like she had lost something essential. She felt like she had reclaimed something that had always been hers. Not the house on Maple Street, not the life defined by routine, but the ground beneath her feet. And she intended to build on it. Autumn arrived slowly over Morgan County. The leaves shifted from deep green to amber and gold, drifting down across the clearing in quiet spirals. The farmhouse windows stood open to cool air. Inside, the scent of fresh wood and brewed coffee lingered in the mornings. Eleanor sat on the porch at sunrise, wrapped in a light wool sweater, watching Atlas stretch stiffly before stepping into the grass. His movements were slower now, deliberate, but steady. Across the field, the training markers she had placed the night before were barely visible in the morning light. Later, a small group from the volunteer search and rescue unit would arrive to run drills. What had started as a quiet idea had become something consistent, structured, purposeful. The wooden sign near the entrance now read, "Whitaker Woodland Canine Training." It wasn't large. It didn't need to be. Ryan had helped install it one Saturday afternoon without being asked. Melissa had brought laminated flyers printed neatly with contact information and volunteer schedules. The distance that once defined their conversations had softened into understanding. Not perfect understanding, but real. Victor Langford's case resolved through civil proceedings that avoided a drawn-out public trial. Financial restitution was negotiated. As liability for the failed infrastructure investments shifted where it belonged. Harold's estate no longer carried the weight of misappropriated funds. Clara Mendez called one evening with the final update. "It's settled," she said simply. "Your husband's name is cleared." Eleanor thanked her quietly and ended the call without ceremony. She stepped onto the porch and watched the wind move through tall grass. Harold had not lived to see the end of it, but he had laid the foundation. Atlas wandered back toward her, carrying one of the training gloves in his mouth. He dropped it at her feet and looked up expectantly. "Still working," she murmured, bending slowly to scratch behind his ear. In the months that followed, Eleanor found herself thinking less about the basement and more about the silence that had once defined her marriage. But not silence born of distance, but silence born of burden. She had once mistaken it for secrecy. Perhaps it had been. But it had also been protection. Harold had not trusted her less. He had feared for her more. That realization did not erase the years she wished she had known more. It did not undo the shock of the estate office or the humiliation of the auction sign, but it reframed them. Some evenings, as the sky turned violet behind the trees, Eleanor would sit in the porch rocker with a blanket over her knees, watching Atlas sleep at her feet. The woodland hummed softly with insects and distant bird calls. The house on Maple Street no longer belonged to her. The concrete basement, the welded hatch, the hidden lockbox. Those moments felt distant now, almost surreal, yet everything had begun there. Yet what Atlas had uncovered beneath the foundation had not simply been documents or deeds, it had been truth. Truth about Harold's fight, truth about Victor's deception, truth about her own capacity to stand alone. She thought back to that first night after the funeral, when the house had felt foreign around her, when grief had been heavy and directionless. She had believed she was being erased. Instead, she had been handed something concealed. Not money, not property, but the opportunity to choose. She chose not to sell the woodland property for convenience. She chose not to retreat into humiliation. She chose to finish what Harold had begun, not out of vengeance, but out of alignment. Atlas stirred in his sleep and shifted closer to her boots. "You found it," she said softly again. He opened one eye briefly, then closed it. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Eleanor leaned back in her chair and let the stillness surround her. Married for 50 years, left with nothing, until her German shepherd found what was hidden beneath. But what had been hidden was more than a lockbox under concrete. It was resilience under grief, protection under silence, strength under fear.
She realized that loss had not been the end of her story. It had been the wrecking of Sophie that had concealed it around. Sometimes was a be devastation is only the first layer giving way. It can be lie reparation. Beneath silence can lie intention. Beneath fear can lie the beginning of courage. Eleanor Whitaker closed her eye and breathed in the cold autumn air. Starting over at 72 had not been a curse. It had been an unveiling. And as the last line slipped beyond the trees, she rested her hand gently on Atlas' back, knowing, required suddenly. She was standing exactly where she was meant to be. Sometimes, the strongest foundations are the ones we don't see until life forces to look beneath the surface. Elena thought she had lost everything until loyalty, memory, and quiet courage revealed what had been there all along. If you were in her place, would you have shown the plan and walk away, or filed to uncover the truth? Share what you would have done in the comments, and if the story moved you, stay with us for more journey about resilience, second chance, and the trend we find when we lose it better.